Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's dinner and a class. My name is Dr. Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service here in Hernando County, and this evening is going to be one of my favorite topics to talk about. So let me go ahead and start with pointing out that if you're watching me right now through our Facebook page or through the Hernando County Extension Facebook gardening group or through our YouTube channel, then you can go ahead and type in the comments and I can actually see the comments and read them. And you can type in your questions and we'll go ahead and answer them. If by some chance you're watching me through another gardening groups page, then whatever you put in the comments, I won't be able to read directly. So keep that in mind when you're trying to ask questions. But if at any point or if at the end you have any questions, let me go ahead and share my email address here, wlester@ufl.edu, and also our office's phone number. We are there. Our office is actually open, even with COVID. So you can come by the office or give us a call if you have a question, email us pictures, and we'll try to help you figure out what is wrong with your plants or what is wrong with your lawn, trees, whatever it may be. So I see we have quite a few people on here already and they're still kind of popping on. So let me go ahead and, like I said, if you have any questions as we go along, go ahead and type them in the comments and I'll be able to see them. But after I start the presentation, I'm going to be kind of blind for a little bit. So we'll probably save most all the questions till the very end. And then at the end, I could scroll through from the very beginning and catch everybody's question and get it answered. But let me go ahead and share my screen here. And here we go. Brenda, I can see your comment. How are you? Yeah, it is a very nice cold day today. So probably not a whole lot of insects out in your garden right now, but I don't know. We have insect problems here pretty much year round. Of course, they're going to be a lot worse during the warmer time of year. But what we're going to cover this evening is a little bit about insect pest identification and control. And the idea behind this class is I'm a member of a lot of different Facebook gardening groups, and I'll see somebody post a question like, what is the safest organic product I can buy to kill bugs in my garden? And I'll respond back with, what kind of bugs are you having a problem with? And they may respond back with, I don't know. Well, it's really hard to give control advice if you don't know what kind of insect you have, or even if you do have an insect. Maybe it's something living on your plants that you don't want to control. Hopefully all of us know that ladybugs are good bugs. You don't want to be spraying to kill the ladybugs. But even that doesn't stop a lot of people from chiming in, and they recommend use this, use that, use all these different things that aren't even labeled to be used in your garden. They're not labeled to be used for an insecticide. So we're going to go through a lot of basics here this evening. Little general outline. I'm going to talk about some of the different major groups of insect pests, some of the most common classes of insecticides to give people a little bit more insight into what those different things they sell at the store are. And then at the end, we're going to go through a couple scenarios just to make sure that you learned something and everybody was staying awake and not getting too busy with eating dinner here. So why would anybody care about this? You know, why should we care? Why should you care? Because all bugs are nasty anyway, right? You know, you go outside in your yard and you see a bug on a sidewalk or on a plant, you know, they're all nasty. They all need to be sprayed or dealt with in one way or another. Insecticides are very easily purchased. I mean, we can go to any lawn and garden center or a big box store and buy all kinds of different things. So they can't possibly be dangerous. You know, if they sell them to me, they must be safe to use. And I know that a lot of older people and older gardeners maybe grew up in a time where, you know, post-World War II era, where insecticides were very, very widely used to control pretty much any kind of insect pest problem. And since they grew up using them, and, you know, Dad used them and my grandparents used them, I've always used them, what could possibly be wrong, right? Well, there's a lot of different things that could be wrong, and this is kind of the reason why all of us here at Extension care about this topic. Homeowner available insecticides can be very dangerous to the applicator, you, or maybe your neighbors or your children or your pets or your neighbor's pets if they're not applied properly. Many of them can be very toxic to other organisms in the environment. For example, many of these products can be used if you follow the directions and apply them correctly. They're very safe for you and for your pets. But if even a small amount washes into any kind of body of water or waterway, they can be extremely toxic to aquatic organisms. Extension cares very much about water resources, and a lot of our programming is to help conserve water and help keep our limited water resources clean. So two big problems that we have with protecting water resources is improper use of insecticides and also improper use of fertilizers, because both of those are really big problems right now. We want to help residents solve their problems, so we don't want to be recommending this, that, and go out and try 10 different things, and maybe one of them works, maybe none of them works, I'm not sure. We really want to help residents solve their problems, quickly and effectively. And also, like I kind of mentioned already, there's a lot of bad information out there. A lot of people who may mean well, but when they start chiming in on what to spray or what to use to control this or that, it may not be the best information. So going through very quickly some of the major groups of insect pests that you probably have in your garden and you're going to have to deal with eventually. A little background information. Knowledge really is power. So it's very important that you always identify the insect first before you start with any kind of chemical controls. You need to get accurate information on control measures first and only use what you're comfortable with. So if somebody else suggests something and you don't know what it is, you're trying to be safe. You might have children in the garden and pets in the garden. That's all great. Look up some information online about what you're thinking about using and make sure that you understand it and that you're comfortable with using it. Now, I also need to kind of preface that with you need to get accurate information. So I think we all know by this point that not everything on the internet is necessarily accurate. So if you start Googling it and reading people's blogs and personal opinion, everybody's entitled to their personal opinion. But if you're looking up accurate information on any kind of pesticide, there are labels online, there's research online, there's reviews online to get you to understand exactly what it is you're thinking about using and deciding whether you're comfortable with using it or not. And then, of course, you always want to scout before you spray. And scouting is just basically checking your plants, going out there and looking through your garden and your plants very carefully, turning over leaves, probably getting either a hand lens or a magnifying glass, because many of these different insects that are the worst pests are very, very small. And if you're not able to get a good look at them and see their shape, their size, you're really kind of shooting blind about identifying them and figuring it out exactly what they are. I always carry a hand lens. I always have one in my car. We have a microscope in our office. So if you bring a sample by for us to look at, we just put it right under the microscope. We get a really good look at it. I even have my own microscope here at home. Not everybody does, but I do. So you always want to scout before you spray and have a really good idea of what it is that you're dealing with. So just a couple really major groups and classes of insects here. Orthoptera is a class of insects that includes grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids. I know everybody goes into a panic over those great big lover grasshoppers, and by the end of summer, they're about 2.5 inches long. People are all convinced that they are just going to eat everything in their yard, and that's not the case. There's certain plants that they will damage severely and defoliate. Any kind of lilies that you have in your yard, amaryllis bulbs are one of their favorites. Maybe if you have a very young citrus tree, they also really like citrus. So you may have to control them, but it's a good example of an insect that you may see in your yard that you could just let it be. Because if they're not actively feeding on your plants or you're sure they're the ones that are causing chewed up leaves, you can just let them be and not worry about them. Don't go into a panic thinking that you have to kill everything out there. I tell people that you can't sanitize the great outdoors. You really can't go out in your yard and try to eliminate everything out there. So sometimes, even if you see a huge grasshopper, you may just have to leave it alone. And of course, the other members of this order, crickets and katydids, they're never a problem. You may see katydids out in the garden every once in a while. They're they get about 3 inches long. They fly. They're bright green. They have really long antennae. And they might chew half of one of your hibiscus leaves, but I've never seen them actually feed on a plant enough to actually cause damage. So another group of insects that you may have never heard of before is Thysanoptera or thrips. And thrips are kind of tricky insects because they're very, very small. A lot of thrips are technically called flower thrips because they live in and feed on primarily inside the flowers. And they can be very damaging because the way they feed is they scrape the surface of the leaf and then suck up the juices that come out of the leaf. And some of them can vector plant diseases. They spread a lot of plant viruses, sometimes with tomatoes and peppers especially. So thrips can come along very early in the season. They feed on your plants, especially when they're just sending out really, really tiny new leaves. And they damage the leaves so that now all the water leaves the leaf and they'll look scorched or really dried up, like this picture here. You see the two, I believe they're Indian hawthorn shrubs, and they were damaged by thrips. Probably in the past, if we pick leaves off that bush right now and look for thrips, we may not even find them at this point, but they did their damage, they left, and the leaves look really brown and curled up. That could very easily be mistaken for an irrigation problem. Some people might think that maybe they didn't fertilize the plants enough, they need to water them more, they have a disease. Really, really hard to actually track it down to thrips sometimes. But they are out there and they're very, very small insects. You're definitely going to need at least a magnifying glass or maybe even a microscope to be able to see them. So Diptera is the insect order of flies. And a little bit of trivia, if you have a small insect and you don't know if it's a bee or a fly, bees always have 4 visible wings and flies only have 2 visible wings. So that's a really good first step to figuring out, is this a bee? Is it a fly? What is it? Trying to track it down. Flies are obviously a really bad human and animal pest. They're dirty. You know, you obviously don't want them landing on your food. And Diptera or flies out in your garden are also called leaf miners. So some species will lay their eggs on a leaf of a plant, and then the immature little flies are going to actually live and feed right in the center of that leaf, and they tunnel around and damage the leaf. A few leaf miners on a few leaves on your plants are no big worry, but if you start to have large numbers of leaves damaged by leaf miners, you may have to take some steps to control them. And when we get up to the part with the actual control recommendations, there is one product that's very, very good for controlling leaf miners. Now, Diptera or flies includes a couple of beneficial insects. There are some flies that come along and lay their eggs in pest insects, and the maturing flies are going to help control them also. So all flies aren't necessarily bad. Lepidoptera, and these are butterflies and moths. And hopefully everybody knows that butterflies and moths come from caterpillars. And caterpillars always feed on some kind of plant material. And caterpillars tend to be a lot of caterpillars are very specific feeders. So you take the example of monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies, their caterpillars are going to feed on milkweed. They don't feed on oaks. They don't feed on tomatoes or peppers or anything in your vegetable garden. So they're very specific feeders. But they all feed on some kind of plant. They have chewing mouth parts, so they're going to chew holes in the leaves. They're going to chew up or consume entire leaves, and they can cause a lot of damage out in the garden. So the picture you see on the upper right-hand side here are caterpillars that you might find on your oleander plant. And what they grow up to be is the little moth you see in the bottom right-hand corner. It looks a lot like a wasp. They're very brightly colored. They're also called polka dot moths because they usually have spots on them. But that's the kind of moth that comes from an oleander caterpillar. And sometimes moths don't even really look like moths. Sometimes they can look like a bee or a wasp. So some other caterpillars that you might see in your garden: monarch butterfly caterpillars on the right. Obviously, if you're raising milkweed to help support the monarch butterfly populations, you're going to be really happy when you see caterpillars eating your plants, not upset, and you're not going to be trying to control them. But the one on the left here, for anybody who has a citrus tree, you'll see these a lot of times in the late winter, early spring, or even in the summer. And it's a giant swallowtail caterpillar. And common name for it is a bird poop caterpillar, because if you see one sitting on a leaf, that's what it looks like, is bird poop. And that way they protect themselves. So birds, if they look at it, are going to think, oh, that's bird poop, I'm not going to mess with that. What it really is a caterpillar. And if you only have a few on your citrus tree, you may want to leave them, because they obviously eventually turn into a giant swallowtail butterfly. And that's one of those kind of butterflies we really want to encourage in our yards and in our butterfly gardens. So a couple other examples of common caterpillars: tomato hornworm. For anybody who has ever tried growing tomatoes or peppers, you will find them eventually on your plants. They're a little hard to see because they are the exact same color as your tomato leaves, and they can get very large. They'll get as large as one of your fingers, basically. And they always have that little horn that sticks out near their rear end. On the right is an azalea caterpillar. And if you have azalea bushes, they're a pretty common pest on azaleas, but you don't find them on anything else. You won't find them on tomatoes or peppers or feeding on anything else in your garden. They are a specific feeder on just azaleas. So another order of insects is Coleoptera, and these are beetles. And there are a huge number of beetles in the world. There's about 300,000 species of beetles around the world that we know of. And researchers and scientists are discovering new species of insects just about every day. And there's about 25,000 different species of beetles here in the United States. And they include many, many different species. A lot of them are pests. A lot of them are beneficial. A lot of them are neither. They're out there. They feed on a wide variety of different things. Some of them feed just on fungi. A lot of them live in the woods, and they live on dead trees and decaying plant matter. But some of them can be a really major problem in the garden, but others can be a really major beneficial in the garden also. So like I said, hopefully everybody knows that ladybugs are good bugs. They're all in the same family, the family Coccinellidae. And you can see from this picture here, they come in a wide variety of colors, patterns, spots. So don't think that they all have to be orange with 10 spots on them. They come in a lot of different varieties and colors. Other beetles, click beetles. Here's a picture of a very large click beetle that you would probably find on a tree or out in the woods. Their immature form is called a wireworm, because it almost looks like a caterpillar, but they're very stiff, like a little piece of wire. And they can be a problem in the garden sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, because they feed on plant roots. So there are some species of beetles and click beetles that are a problem if you're trying to grow peppers. They'll feed on the pepper roots and cause problems that way, but it's not a very common problem. We don't see that very often. Other beetles, other scarab beetles, come from a grub. So you see the picture on the right is a beetle grub. And I see pictures like this on Facebook all the time, and people are asking, what is this? What do I do to get rid of them? That's going to grow to be some kind of, I guess we use the common name June bugs. That's what I call them. But some kind of scarab beetle. So you see on the left-hand side here on the bottom is a very large green June bug or June beetle. And then on the upper left-hand side is the smaller brown June bug. So small beetle grubs turn into small beetles. very, very large beetle grubs can turn into very large beetles. So if you find beetle grubs that look like the picture on the right here in your garden or in a potted plant, don't go into a panic. You have to have a lot of beetle grubs for them to actually damage anything. Most of them feed on either grass or weed roots that are either growing in your lawn or in a wild area near your house. And like I said, you have to have on average about 10 or 20 of them per square foot for it to actually be considered a problem and for you to actually go and start taking some kind of steps to control them. So if you find just a few beetle grubs, they're going to grow up to be beetles, and the adult beetles don't damage anything. So adult June bugs, they might fly around and hit you in the head or fly around your porch lights at night, but they're really not a pest, not anything that you have to be too concerned about or take any kind of chemical steps to get rid of. There are some other beetles, like the picture on the left here is a yellow margin leaf beetle, and they're pretty small. They're maybe 1/8 of an inch long, 1/4 inch long. And if you have in your vegetable garden turnips or kale or even broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage, they will feed on that. But they don't come out until early spring, usually after March, which is after when you want to be growing those crops. And the same with the picture on the right-hand side here. These are Colorado potato beetles, and they will come out and they will eat all your cool season brassicas, things like kale and even collards and broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage, but they don't come out until late spring. So if you're trying to grow those cool season vegetables, the kale, turnips, things like that, grow them during the winter and plan on them being done by March. And if you're done with them by March and you have your spring crops in the ground, you will never have a problem with these beetles, because I know when people say, I have a problem with yellow margin leaf beetles, I can usually tell them, oh, you're trying to grow vegetables out of season. You're trying to grow them too late into the spring, and that's why you're having an insect problem. So a lot of times you can help control your insect problems by just proper timing, growing the correct things at the correct time of year. And if you get them in at just the right time, you can grow them in a time of the year where the insect pests are not even present. So it's a really good way to get kind of tricky and actually avoid problems. So another large group of insects is in the order Hemiptera. And in some books, you might see this broken up into 2 different separate orders. In some guides, they're all lumped into one big group. All these insects have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So what they do is they feed on your plants, and they will poke into the leaves or stems. They poke into your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your eggplants, your fruit. They'll poke into your citrus. Pretty much anything you're growing out there, they will poke into. And they suck the water and the nutrients out of it, and that way they cause a lot of damage to your plants or to the vegetables and fruits that you're trying to grow. So this includes things like aphids, mealybugs, stink bugs, whiteflies, cicadas. Cicadas are the insects that make all the noise in the summer. They fly around the trees. They are never a pest, but they're in this group also. Leaf hoppers, plant hoppers, scales, and leaf-footed bugs. So that's a lot of different insect pests right there. And they all have the same kind of mouth part. They're all going to cause the same kind of damage. This also includes assassin bugs, ambush bugs, and minute pirate bugs and predatory stink bugs, which are all in the same order also, but they're all beneficial insects and good guys, because they're going to catch and feed on and kill a lot of the different plant pests out in our garden. So here are some pictures here. In the upper left-hand corner is oleander aphids. We have a lot of different species of aphids here in Florida. They can be orange or green or brown or tan or gray. They cover kind of a wide range of colors. Oleander aphids are really easy to spot because they're bright orange and they have black antennae and legs. Bottom left-hand corner here, we have whiteflies. They are very, very tiny little insects that when they're mature adults, they have little white wings. Bottom right-hand corner is a plant hopper. We have dozens of species of plant hoppers and tree hoppers. Some of them are major pests. Other ones are just going to feed on weeds or native trees or a wide variety of plants. Scales. Here in Florida, we have a couple dozen different species of scales, and they cover a wide range of colors and sizes. The one thing about scales, though, is they don't run around your plants. So when a scale is born, it has legs and it crawls around and it picks a spot where it's going to live the rest of its life. Right after that, it molts and it starts to make a hard shell on its back, the actual scale, and it's never going to move after that. It's just going to sit there. So people will get confused. They'll look at their plants or undersides of the leaves and they see something that's like, is that a bump? Is it a scale? Is it a part of the plant? Is this something I need to worry about? Or is it a natural part of the plant? And that gets a little confusing, but we know, and we could tell from the color and the shape of it, whether it's a scale or not. And you see in the bottom picture there, there's a bunch of scales and there's a big old ant with them. And ants get kind of confusing for people because I think that might, no, that's not on my next slide, but ants will actually herd or take care of a lot of these insects like scales and aphids and whiteflies, because when those insects feed on your plants, they excrete a really sugary substance that ants absolutely love. So ants will literally herd scales and whiteflies and aphids the way that we would herd cows, because we're trying to get the milk from the cows. So kind of the same idea there. So sometimes if you see ants on your plants, the ants aren't the problem. It's whatever kind of insect the ants are herding and trying to protect that might be a problem. So you need to take a step and look a little bit closer and see if you actually have scales or whiteflies or aphids or something else that you need to control. Here's a couple other examples. We have stink bugs in Florida. We have green stink bugs and brown ones and gray ones. The upper right-hand corner there is a big-eyed bug, and they're really small. They're maybe the size of a grain of pepper. And the bottom left-hand corner there are chinch bugs. So if any of you have a St. Augustine lawn, you know that chinch bugs can be a pest of St. Augustine grass and they can really damage it. If you have a service that sprays your yard, they spray for chinch bugs. All of them do. The problem is a lot of times they don't do a really good job of actually checking for chinch bugs, because chinch bugs and big-eyed bugs can both live in your lawn. They're both very small. They're both maybe the size of a grain of pepper. And you see they look kind of similar, but I'll give you a little hint. The reason the big-eyed bug got its name is because they have really big eyes. So if you look at one, if I look at one under a microscope, I can tell the difference right away. Big-eyed bugs eat chinch bugs. So if you have a St. Augustine lawn and you have to go out there and actually check your lawn, go out there, get on your hands and knees with your head down, your butt up in the air with a hand lens or a magnifying glass and look and see who's living in your yard. If you have a bunch of big-eyed bugs and only a few chinch bugs, you probably don't want to spray your lawn. If you legitimately have a bunch of chinch bugs, and I think the cutoff level is about 20 per square foot. So if you take a couple samples and you see 25 per square foot on average, you probably need to spray your lawn. But if you don't know if you have chinch bugs or big-eyed bugs or what is in your yard, you probably don't need to spray your yard, or you need to look a little bit deeper before you start spraying. And the bottom right-hand corner here is a leaf foot bug. They're kind of closely related to stink bugs. They look similar, but how they got their name is if you look at that back leg, what would that be? The tibia there is really flattened out and looks a little bit like a leaf. So that's why we call them leaf-footed bugs. So to make things a little bit more confusing, here's a picture from an eggplant that I had growing in my backyard a couple years ago. And I had all these little bugs on it. And they're really small. They're newborn. Really didn't know off the top of my head exactly what they were. I did a little checking, and what these are immature leaf-footed bugs. And if we go back to the picture of the adult leaf-footed bug here, you see what they look like. and you see what the immature ones look like, and they look totally different. Different color, different shape. Obviously, the adult ones are going to have wings. Those are wings on its back. That's a lot of times how you can tell if an insect is an adult or not. And these little ones don't have any wings on them. So to make it even tougher, you're over time going to have to learn what these insect pests look like when they're adults, and also what they look like when they're immature or really small, to catch the problems early and figure out, do I need to spray or do something, or do I not? So like I already said, ants are really not a plant pest. They don't eat your plants. They don't eat the leaves. They don't cause any damage, but they can be an indication that you have some other kind of problem that is damaging your plants. Normally, if you see a lot of ants, your problem is you have some kind of scale or a mealybug or aphid. That's the most common insects that they're trying to protect. And they will actually protect them from other predators that are trying to help you out by eating them. So don't worry about the ants, worry about the underlying problem or the reason why the ants are there. So mites are really not insects because they have 8 legs. Insects have 6 legs. And there's a number of different species of mites that we have here in Florida. Some of them are beneficial, other ones are pests, but probably the most common one that you're ever going to encounter is going to be spider mites. And spider mites got their name because when you have a lot of them, they start to make webbing on your plants. And it looks like you have little tiny spider webs on there. They use that webbing for protection because other predator insects that might want to come along and eat them, and other beneficial predator mites, they hate the webbing. They get tangled in it, so they tend to stay away. So the webbing is going to protect the spider mites, and it literally gives them a little highway to get around because they'll crawl on that webbing and use it to get from spot A to spot B on your plants. Spider mites really like it where it's hot and sunny. They're a main problem in the heat of summer, especially if we have a dry summer, they'll get really bad. And it's really important to check your plants frequently. And if you do start to get a few spider mites on there, control them early, because they will lay lots of eggs and make lots of babies, and their populations will grow very, very quickly. And they'll go from being a little problem to being a big problem very quickly. So that's definitely one that frequent scouting and frequent checking your plants is really going to help control that. There's a picture, and it's a little fuzzy because, like I said, spider mites are very, very small. If you were to look at them under a microscope and you start counting, they do have 8 legs. So that's one way of telling that it's a spider mite. And sometimes they're green, sometimes they're kind of like tan with 2 spots on their back, and other times they're a bright brick red. So you can't always go by the color on them. You have to go by the shape and the number of legs. So let me try to go on here real quick and see what kind of questions I'm getting and answer a question or two before we go on to just kind of a real big overview of some of the different classes of insecticides that you're going to find at the store. Are lubbers native to Florida? Yes, lubber grasshoppers are a native insect. They weren't brought here. They're not invasive. They do feed on a variety of plants, but they eat surprisingly little for their size. I think a lot of people think because they're so big, they must eat a lot, but that's really not true. So you can have a couple lubber grasshoppers sitting on a hedge, sitting on a tree, sitting on a sidewalk, and they're probably not really feeding on your plants. Certain plants they will gobble up. Like I said, amaryllis I think is their all-time favorite. Crinum lilies they'll eat up also. They are a big problem if you have a small citrus tree. So you need to make sure that you don't have lubbers actually feeding on them. But don't think that because you walk outside and you see 2 or 3 grasshoppers, you have to spray your entire yard to control them, because that's really not the case. And spraying your entire yard and throwing everything out of balance just to kill 2 or 3 or 4 or even 10 grasshoppers is probably not a really good idea. So Isabel says, I think I have scale on my plants. That could very well be because, like I said, we have a dozen or 24 different species of scales that we see pretty frequently. They all tend to be different colors, slightly different shapes, so we can track them down pretty quickly at the office to figure out exactly what they are. But scales can be a really big problem. Like I said, I'm going to show our phone number and my email once again at the end. If you are able to take good pictures of some kind of pest and you don't know what it is, feel free to email me the pictures. If you live in Hernando County and you're able to come by the office, please feel free to do so. We're more than happy to look at insects all day long and help figure out what they are. And if I don't know what they are, I know people at Gainesville at the University of Florida that know better than I do, and I can send those pictures and samples off to them, and we'll figure out what's wrong. So Margaret asked, what is the best way to get rid of stink bugs? They were all over my veggies last year. We're going to cover that. So when we get into the actual recommended controls, I'll tell you exactly what you can do to get rid of them. And Judy asked about the white cottony stuff. Is that a fungus or an insect? That could be mealybugs. Mealybugs look like a little tiny piece of a cotton ball on your plants. But sometimes if you have a fungal problem, it can get white, a little white and fuzzy also. So we probably are going to need a picture to say exactly what that is. But let's go ahead and move on, and I'm going to cover just a really broad overview of some of the different major groups or classes of insecticides. So a little background, natural doesn't always necessarily mean safe. So just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe for you to use or legal for you to use or you really want to use it. Because keep in mind, arsenic is in the soil. Doesn't get a whole lot more natural than that. And people have used arsenic, you know, many, many hundreds or thousands of years ago as one of the early pest controls. And we don't want to be spraying arsenic on our plants out in our garden. So don't take that as a recommendation. Other things like nicotine sulfate, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. That you don't get any more natural than that. Basically, you grow tobacco and you take the plants and you squeeze the liquid as kind of a brown sticky liquid out of it, mix it with water, spray it on your plants. Does a fantastic job of killing aphids and pretty much everything else that might be on your plants. It is extremely dangerous for you to use. It was actually used as an insecticide and has been off the market and banned for, gosh, I think like 20, 30 years at this point. When you're looking for an insecticide, don't get kind of drawn in or really involved with the manufacturer's name, the catchy name, and the little pictures all over the front, pictures of the insects on their back with their little legs up in the air. What you want to look on is the active ingredient in that product. And feel free to go home and Google it and look it up, contact us for information, and actually learn what it is, what it's going to be effective on, what kind of drawbacks there might be with it. Maybe it's going to kill more things in your yard than you're trying to kill. So learn a little bit about it and actually focus on the active ingredients. And then understand fully all the effects that product's going to have potentially on you when you're applying it. The pests, is it going to be effective for the actual pests that you're trying to control? How is it going to affect all the beneficial insects and other beneficial things that you may have in your yard? All the toads and lizards and birds and everything else that lives in your yard that eats a lot of insects and gives you a lot of free control, and what kind of effects it's going to have on the environment also. Obviously, if you live next to a body of water or a lake or a pond, you're going to have to be extra careful about what you actually use in your yard, because you wouldn't want that to get into the body of water and start to cause all kinds of problems. So knowledge is very, very important. So going way back, organochlorines are an old group of insecticides. None of them are currently available to homeowners. That includes things like DDT, dieldrin, chloridane, and endosulfan. they are extremely persistent in the environment. So they stay active and don't break down potentially for many, many years, which in some instances, that's kind of necessary. That's what you're looking for. But in the, if anybody remembers or has read anything about many years ago when DDT was used, the problem is that would get in the environment and it would not break down for many, many, many years. And a lot of times we really don't want something like that in our yards. We want it to be effective and do the job and break down pretty quickly so it doesn't affect something that we don't want to damage or control or hurt. Organophosphates are another large group of insecticides. This includes things like Lorsban, Dursban, Diazinon. Maybe some of you remember them. They are all in red because they are no longer on the homeowner market. So homeowners can't legally purchase those products and use them in their yards. This does include malathion, which is still available. Homeowners can buy that. This is a neurotoxin that blocks, this is a big fancy word, acetylcholinesterase, which is contained in nerve endings of insects and also human beings. We have it in us also. It's a very wide spectrum insecticide, so if you use it, it's going to kill what you're trying to kill and probably a lot of other things also potentially. And the EPA lists organophosphates as very highly acutely toxic to bees, wildlife, and humans. So obviously you want to think twice or maybe even 3 times before you start using any organophosphates in your yard, and make sure it's a situation where that is the only control that you have available to you and it's the appropriate control. Carbamates are another group, and they include aldicarb, the common name is Temic, and carbaryl, the common name for that is 7, and methimyl. That's also a neurotoxin that also blocks acetylcholinesterase. It just blocks it in a different way than organophosphates do. And both organophosphates and carbamates, they do break down in the environment, but it could take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, you know, all depending on the exact chemical. But carbamates tend to be very wide spectrum or broad spectrum insecticides also. So nicotine sulfate, I mentioned already that that's about as natural as you can get. You just grow a tobacco plant, squeeze the juice out of it, spray it. The only problem is it is extremely toxic and very dangerous to the applicator. That's why it was taken off the market many years ago, and it's very wide spectrum. It's going to kill and damage a lot of things that are out in your yard. But chemists really like that nicotine atom, and they really liked how it worked really, really well on insects. So what they did was they took the nicotine molecule and kind of played with it in the lab, because that's what chemists do. And they designed synthetic nicotine, also called neonicotinoids. So that's basically where it came from. So these molecules are very similar to nicotine and they work very well. The problem is they are more longer lasting. So they give longer lasting control, which in a commercial environment, and for some people, that's a real bonus. For a homeowner garden, maybe not so much. So this includes things that you may have heard of before. Imidacloprid is very common. Dinotefuran, the common name, or a common brand of that is Safari, and several others. These things can be taken up systemically in the plant through the roots. So when an insect, like I mentioned, those members of the group Hemiptera, they have a piercing, sucking mouth part, so they poke into your plant, they suck the juices out. If you use something that's systemic in the plant, that's a good way to actually get it to them. Problem is, these things are very toxic to bees, and they have been implicated in a lot of adverse ecological effects. So on that note, researchers are still doing a lot of work on this to find out their exact impacts, exact effects. But as a general rule, using these things a lot in your yard, just kind of willy-nilly trying to control insects, they may even be imaginary insects, maybe you don't even know what kind of insects they are, is probably not a really good idea. So Pyrethrin is another product that you can purchase. This is a lot of times Pyrethrin is labeled as an organic pest control because it's extracted from a chrysanthemum that comes from South Africa. So Pyrethrin, you can buy it in lawn and garden centers, big box stores. You can obviously find it online. It has a really good knockdown effect. And that question from earlier about stink bugs, who is it? I see somebody else here asked also about leaf-footed bugs. For larger beetles and stink bugs, this stuff works really well. If you spray it, you have to actually hit the adult insect, but you'll see them, boom, they just fall to the ground right off your plant. The problem is you want to make sure the Pyrethrin also contains pyrethroid butoxide, which is really never used as an insecticide all by itself. But when it is used in conjunction with Pyrethrin, the Pyrethrin has a really good knockdown effect. But believe it or not, the bugs can recover from it, come back to life, crawl back on your plants. If it's combined with pyrethroid butoxide, which it usually is, basically the insects stay down. So it's very, very effective, very safe to use. And a nice thing is it breaks down very quickly in the environment. It usually breaks down into harmless compounds within 24, 48 hours, broken down by sunlight, moisture, rain. And like I said, it's one of the very few effective controls, effective organic controls, if that's what you want to use in your yard, on larger insect pests, things like stink bugs, leaf-footed bugs, larger beetles, grasshoppers, things like that. So once again, the chemists really liked the molecule that was in Pyrethrin, and they took that and worked with it a little bit and created a whole nother group of synthetic pyrethrins, which are called pyrethroids. So pyrethroids include things like bifenthrin. If you have a service that sprays your yard and you have St. Augustine grass and they spray for chinch bugs, they're almost always spraying with bifenthrin. There's a couple other products out there, but bifenthrin is commonly used for pest control in St. Augustine lawns on chinch bugs. Permethrin, cypermethrin, basically anything that ends in thrin is going to be a pyrethroid. It's used very commonly in indoor insecticides, things that you may spray for roaches or silverfish or other things that might be in your house. These things are all highly toxic to aquatic organisms, so you have to be very, very careful with them. And they're also, these are a wide spectrum neurotoxin. So out in your garden, you probably want to, if you're thinking about or commonly using one of these, you want to read up information on it and make sure that you're comfortable with using them. So neem, I know a lot of people really, really like neem, and they think that neem is kind of a silver bullet or a cure-all that's going to fix every problem that you might have out in your garden and could kill just the bad bugs and not kill the good bugs. Nah, not exactly correct. This is a natural extract from a tree that grows in India, and it's a really funny compound because it contains multiple compounds. Some of them do actually kill insects, so if it's sprayed on an insect, it will kill it. For other insects, it just deters them from feeding. If you have neem sprayed on your plant, the insect's going to land on it. And it's like, oh, neem is nasty and sticky. I'm not going to feed on your plant now. And some of the compounds actually act as a fungicide. So it's going to help control some fungal problems, but it's going to have no effect on other fungal problems. So it tends to be a really mixed bag. And you can have a really wide range of effectiveness. So if you buy neem oil from 5 different manufacturers, it may have 5 different levels of effectiveness. And even from one batch to another, there can be a wide variation on it. Like I said, it can be used as a fungicide in certain situations, but in other situations, it's going to have no effect, no positive effect on controlling fungal problems. So Biorationals, these are mostly new products that have been discovered by research. So if you're still using things that you used in your garden 20, 30, 40 years ago, you're missing out on a lot of new things that are available in the marketplace now. that can work really well to control insects and help control some of your other problems, and are very, very safe for you and your pets and kids and neighbors to use. So this is controlling insects with either other organisms or the toxins that they produce. And the nice thing about this is many of them are very, very specific. They're going to control 1 or 2 or 3 problems really well, and they're not going to injure anything else out in your yard. And we're going to see with some of them exactly how they do that. There's a lot of examples out there. We have a really nasty invasive plant called tropical soda apple. And for any of you who may be familiar with it, it has huge spines on it. It makes things that look like a tomato. It's in the tomato family. And it's a really bad problem for anybody who has cattle or horses, because your animals will eat it. It gets shed back out in their manure, spreads like crazy. They actually found a plant virus that if you spray tropical soda apple with it, this virus will kill the tropical soda apple. Does a fantastic job of it and will not affect any other plants in your yard except peppers. So you have to be careful not to use it next to a pepper farm, because you're going to really upset the farmer if you start affecting his pepper plants with this. So probably the best example of this is going to be something called Bacillus thuringiensis. And this is a naturally occurring bacteria. The common name for this is BT. You can find it at stores. It's in products. If you see anything that says it's an organic caterpillar killer, Thuricide is one product that contains BT. Dipel is another one. So there's a lot of products out there that contain it, but this is a naturally occurring bacteria that only kills caterpillars. So it kills caterpillars and controls them very, very well, does not hurt anything else. So a caterpillar can eat this, and a bird can fly by very quickly and eat that caterpillar, won't hurt the bird. A lizard can eat one, won't hurt the lizard. It's harmless to other organisms. Like I said, it's available under a couple different trade names, either online or in stores. Another nice thing about this is it breaks down quickly in the environment. So for a home gardener, you're going to have to spray it on a fairly regular basis if you're growing something that has a lot of problems with caterpillars. But a nice thing about it is it's not persistent in the environment, and it's going to break down pretty quickly. Another newer product is Spinosad, also called Spinosad. This is another naturally occurring soil bacteria that is toxic to several pests, but very low toxicity to most beneficials. If you spray this on your plant, it is partly systemic, so it will go into your plant, and it's very, very effective also on caterpillars and leaf miners. If you remember, I mentioned early on about leaf miners. That's a little fly larva that gets in the center of a leaf. And think about this. He's hiding in the middle of your leaf, and if you start spraying stuff on the outside of the leaf miners in the center just kind of waving at you and laughing, and you're not doing it a whole lot of harm. But if you use something like Spinosad, which is very toxic to leaf miners and actually goes into the leaf, it's a very good way to control them. Very good control for thrips also, and also good control for ants. They're starting to incorporate it into more and more ant baits. And something like this is going to be safer to use in your yard than maybe some of the older ant baits and more toxic, stronger products. So crop oils, maybe if you're a little bit older, or maybe you remember maybe your father or grandfather spraying fruit trees up north with something called a dormant oil. This is a crop oil. And years ago, it was a dormant oil because it's the actual oil. And if you spray it on trees, deciduous trees that have no leaves, and it works really well on fruit trees when the leaves are off of them, any little mites and spider mites and scales and things like that hiding on the bark or the trunk of the tree, it covers them and smothers them and did a very good job of controlling them. Well, now we have much, much better products on the market. They're much more highly refined, and you can spray it on the plants when they have leaves also. Very good control for any kind of small insect. It's still the #1 insecticide by volume the citrus growers use against any kind of piercing sucking insects, scales, mites, works well on whiteflies, aphids, mealybugs, any of them works really, really well and really safe to use. But here in Florida, any kind of oil that you might use, this means neem oil, horticultural oil, they can be phytotoxic to your plants and can actually like burn or sunburn the leaves if you use them when it's really hot and really sunny. So we tell people that you can use any kind of oils during the winter, generally from fall through spring. But from spring, once it starts to warm up and get sunny, all the way through fall, you want to be very, very careful using them. You want to spray just a part of the plant or a few leaves first to make sure it doesn't have any kind of phytotoxic effect. I've seen people spray pole beans with neem oil during, I guess it was late spring, early summer, and they burnt the heck out of their plants. All their plants looked like they hit it with a flamethrower, basically. Leaves all turned brown and dry and crispy. Didn't kill the plants, they came back, but they were knocked back for about 2 or 3 weeks, did a lot of damage. So insecticidal soap, this is an ingredient. This is totally different from any kind of dish soap or dish liquid. Problem with using any kind of dish liquids for insect control, number one, it's not labeled as an insecticide, so there's no directions about how to mix it to control insects, no information on what it's going to control. And most dish liquids now are dish detergents. And detergents can be very, very damaging to your plants a lot of times. Dish soaps and dish detergents generally will kill an insect, but they may not be very safe under all circumstances for the plants you're using them on. Insecticidal soap is potassium fatty acids, and it's a special substance that is designed for insect control on your plants. If you follow the directions and use it properly, you're not going to damage your plants. And it works very, very well on any kind of really small, soft-bodied insects. Things like aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, spider mites, a whole bunch of different ones. It only works if you actually hit the insect with the insecticidal soap. But generally, if you follow the label, you're going to be able to use it on a pretty regular basis. And it usually takes more than one spray to actually get your insect pest under control. But insecticidal soap is going to work, gosh, probably 90% of the time and solve maybe 90% of your different insect problems. So when you see insects out there in your yard, sitting on your plants, sitting on the driveway, wherever you might see them, you need to ask yourself, are they destructive or are they beneficial? Hopefully, like I said earlier, everybody knows that ladybugs are good bugs, but do you know what an immature ladybug looks like? Do you know what immature ladybugs of all the different native species we have in that family look like? If you see something you're not familiar with it, don't assume that it's destructive. You may have a lot of beneficial insects on your plants crawling around, and if you don't dig a little bit deeper, you're not going to know that. Then you need to ask yourself, do they need to be controlled? You know, obviously, if you have a lot of ladybugs, you don't need to control them. Do you have a lot of aphids? Are you sure they're aphids? If it is a pest like aphids, are there a lot of beneficial insects present? So a lot of times I'll turn over like a cucumber leaf and I'll see some aphids and I'll see some ladybugs. If you have kind of, equal amounts, then you probably don't have to spray that day. If you have a lot more aphids and ladybugs, maybe you need to spray. But these are all things that need to kind of figure into your decision, do I spray or not? And then you need to look at what is the safest, least toxic thing to me, yet effective control. So if it's not going to be effective, what's the point of spraying it, right? These things cost money. You're just wasting your time and money. But you want to start with the safest, least toxic thing. You don't want to start with going nuclear and pick the most broad spectrum thing that is probably going to kill the aphids, and it's going to kill the ladybugs, and it may kill a lot of other off-target organisms, and it may find its way into a waterway or into groundwater also. So you want to start with the safest, least toxic thing that's still going to actually get the job done. So going into quiz time here. Before we do this, Let me go back up here and try to catch a couple more questions. So we talked about what is the best way to get rid of stink bugs. Stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs are a very, very common pest on a lot of different vegetables that get a fruit. So think like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, eggplants. I showed the picture of my eggplants. And they damage the fruit and make it really unsightly, because what they do is when a tomato is really small, they poke into it. And when the tomato gets larger, it has these holes in it that grow larger. The holes they leave behind are a really good way for bacteria to get into the tomato. The tomato may start to rot and you get a bad side and just stink bugs. You really want to control them early on because they cause a lot of long-term damage. So Lena says she usually has leaf-footed bugs and aphids all over her milkweed plants. Should I treat them or no, because it will harm the monarch caterpillars as well? You know, Lena, hold that question for just a minute, because I think we're going to talk about that in just a second here. Here's a good question. Sylvia asks, when I walk on the grass, I disturb little flying insects. What is the insect that flies just above the grass and resettles? So if you have a St. Augustine lawn, what that is it's probably little tiny moths that come from caterpillars that are called tropical sod webworms. Tropical sod webworms are really, really tiny caterpillars that can feed on your St. Augustine grass. And how you could tell if you have a problem with it, you have to get up close and personal with your lawn and get down on your hands and knees and look at those grass blades. And if you look at the grass blade and you see little chew marks out of the side of the grass blade, that's from tropical sod webworms. If you check your lawn and you don't see any damage or very little damage, because we rarely see them to the point where they're actually damaging a St. Augustine lawn. So if you see no damage or just a little bit of damage and you see the moths flying around your lawn, you can probably ignore them. I know a lot of services and a lot of people go into a panic and like to treat for them, but if you don't start suffering actual damage to your lawn, you probably don't need to spray for it. And spraying for the moths does reduce the population of moths. Fewer moths mean fewer moths laying eggs and making more baby caterpillars, but keep in mind moths fly. So moths can always fly in from your neighbor's yard, from down the street. They do get around. So the smartest thing to do if you have a St. Augustine lawn and you're worried about problems with tropical sod webworm is just keep a close eye on your lawn and look at those grass blades. If you start to see them chewed up around the edge or a lot of chewing damage in your lawn, you probably need to treat for them and treat for them when the caterpillars are really small. And you probably don't need to worry too much about the actual little moths, although they will be an indication that you potentially have a problem with them. So we have a question about what to do with bugs on milkweed plants. And you know, there's a lot of insects that like feeding on milkweeds other than just monarch butterfly caterpillars. So in scenario one, you're growing milkweed plants in your butterfly garden. And I'm going to scroll up here and I'm going to try actually, you guys are going to chime right in. And if you know the answer, just go ahead and type it right in here. I can see. So you're growing milkweed plants in your butterfly garden. And you see something like this. It's like, oh my gosh, I have bugs. What do I spray? What do I do to get rid of them? There's bugs on my milkweed plant and they don't look like monarch caterpillars to me. You are correct. They are not monarch caterpillars. These are called milkweed bugs. And they are a bug. They have a piercing, sucking mouth part. And they are ligid bugs, I think. Don't hold me to that. But what they do is they feed on seeds. And the reason why they're on your milkweed plant is because you see the flower at the top. Milkweeds flower, and they do set seeds, and you can save the seeds. These bugs are just hanging out, waiting for the seeds to come out, and they're going to feed on the seeds. So if you're raising milkweed to save the seeds, you want to get rid of milkweed bugs, but you really want to avoid spraying your plants, because if you do, you're probably going to adversely affect the caterpillars that you're trying to raise. So there's a lot of different things that kind of go into your decision here. It's not as easy as see bug, spray bug. So here's the same milkweed plant, and you see those little orange dots on those. Down near the bottom, you get a good look at a couple of them. Those are aphids right there. And those are oleander aphids, but oleander aphids obviously feed on a lot of different plants. And they're bright orange. They have little black legs and antenna. And you see a lot of aphids on there. But I see a big, or it's kind of big in the picture, but in real life, it would be really, really small. A little, what looks like a caterpillar. And if you sit there like I do sometimes and look at plants a little bit too much to see what everybody is doing, you would see that little caterpillar crawl around, and I could see more than one on there, and they come up to the aphid, and they grab the aphid, and they just gobble it right up. And that is a syrphid fly larva, which comes from syrphid flies. They're also called hoverflies. They're really, really common in your garden. They come in dozens of different sizes, shapes, colors. A lot of times they look like a teeny tiny little bee, but it's actually a fly. And they smell aphids, and they lay their eggs in groups of aphids. And the little immature syrphid larva crawls around and gobbles up aphids. So if you're looking at your plant, you see aphids, you see little things that look like teeny tiny little caterpillars, they're probably eating the aphids. So that's a situation where you probably don't want to spray anything. You want to keep monitoring it, and maybe you're going to have to spray eventually. But a lot of times those beneficial insects will give you an awful lot of positive control, keeping those pests under control. So here's another scenario right here. And this kind of goes into something I didn't really mention a whole lot of, but we'll go ahead and work through it and see what the real problem is here. So you have an azalea bush, and you have it planted in a nice sunny spot in your yard, and something is damaging the leaves. Obviously, these leaves don't look right. So you examine the underside of the leaves, and you think you see something, but you're not really sure. Well, I know from that kind of damage on your plant, that's probably either spider mites or azalea lace bugs. They're both very small. They live on the undersides of the leaves, and they poke into the leaf, and they damage it that way. But you know what makes it really bad is at the very first sentence of this, you have an azalea in a sunny spot in your yard. If you plant your azaleas in a full sun location, they're going to dry out very quickly. They're not going to grow well. They're going to get weaker and probably die over the first couple of years, because azaleas don't like to grow in very, very sunny spots. They like partly sunny spots. They do best underneath oak trees, where they get a lot of speckled sun and a lot of shade during the day. And azaleas that are planted in the correct spot, where they get only partial sun, partial shade, we very rarely see them have bad problems with spider mites or azalea lace bugs. But if you plant them in a really sunny spot, remember, spider mites really like it where it's sunny and dry and hot, and you will probably have a very bad problem with spider mites on your azaleas, and they're probably going to kill your azalea. So another example of looking a little bit deeper to figure out what the real problem is. So scenario number 3, and gosh, I see this all summer long in different Facebook groups. You're growing cucumbers here in Hernando County or Central Florida in your vegetable garden, and it's late June, and there are worms drilling holes in your cucumbers. What is an IPM or integrated pest management principle that you should use in the future, and what is an effective chemical control? So 2 parts to this, 2 solutions to this. So if anybody wants to chime in really quickly and tell me what the real problem is here. If I see this, I think that the real underlying problem is you're trying to grow cucumbers in your garden in late June, because cucumbers grow here in Central Florida in the spring and in the fall. They're really hard to grow in the fall because you still have a lot of insects and diseases out in the fall. But if you plant them in the spring, up north you plant them and grow them during June, July, and August. Down here, you need to plan on your cucumbers being done by June 1st as a general rule, because after that you will get a lot of worms in your cucumbers. So you need to plant your cucumbers very, very early as late February. And if we get a cold night or a little bit of a freeze or a frost, you're going to have to cover them and try to protect them as best you can. But you need to plant them early, because otherwise what happens is when they're growing out there a little bit later, May or June, we have a little moth come along and it's going to lay eggs on the fruit. And they're called pickle worms. And the caterpillar is going to drill holes into your cucumbers, yellow squash, zucchini squash. They drill into the flowers, they drill in the fruit, and nobody likes little caterpillars inside their cucumber or their yellow squash. So one way to control them is plant your crops at the right time of year, plant them really early. And something that is very effective on them and works fairly well is spinosad or spinosad. If you remember when I mentioned that earlier, it's systemic. It'll go into the leaves and the flowers and the fruit, and it's very, very effective on caterpillars. So you're going to have to, if the caterpillars show up before you're done growing your cucumbers in the spring, you're probably going to have to use spinosad and maybe BT also to help control them. But if you try growing cucumbers later than June, let's say July and August, they are most likely not going to do really well. It's going to be a really, really tough struggle for you to actually get any fruit off of them. Some people do, and somebody is probably going to comment here that they're actually able to, but it's really, really difficult. So scenario number 4, it's almost Christmas. So think December during the winter, and your citrus tree has something wrong with it. There's this black stuff on the leaves, little bumps on the stem, and a strange black fly on the underside of the leaf. What could these things be, and what would you treat it with if you want to treat it? So let me show you a picture of what I'm talking about here. This, you remember earlier I mentioned whiteflies, and whiteflies are a really common pest on a lot of different plants. Believe it or not, to make it worse, we have black flies. We have something called citrus black fly. And what it looks like is a whitefly that's black. So kind of makes sense. The lower left-hand picture here is what they look like on the bottom of a citrus leaf. Upper right-hand picture here is what the immature ones look like before they're adults and they have wings. What they look like is a tiny little white fly when they're adults with wings, but they're black. So they damage citrus trees. But if you remember what I mentioned earlier, something is safe and effective to use during the winter, not really safe to use during the height of summer, but during the winter you can use it, is some kind of crop oil or horticultural oil. So that would probably be the best control for that. And I think we have 2 more scenarios here. So real quick, here's one. This is a parsley plant. And people grow parsley in their herb garden. You need to plant it during the winter. Plant it in the fall, like September, October. It's going to grow all winter long. It's going to taste great. It'll keep growing, but after we start to warm up in March, it gets bitter. It doesn't taste as good. And around March or April or so, you're going to see these big caterpillars show up. It's like, oh my gosh, what is that big striped thing that's chowing down on my parsley and dill? They like dill also. And they get big. I mean, they're big caterpillars, and they will eat a lot. Some people are thinking like, oh my gosh, what do I spray to get rid of this huge caterpillar because it's eating my parsley? Well, you want to think a little bit about that and actually learn what it is, because what that is that's the caterpillar that's going to turn into the eastern black swallowtail. And for anybody with a butterfly garden or a natural garden where you're trying to attract butterflies to your garden, this is one of the biggest and prettiest ones that you can get living there. And if you actually take your parsley and dill, when you're done with it, we're getting into spring, the plants are starting to look rough, maybe they're flowering, they're starting to decline, the parsley doesn't taste very good. Just take this parsley and give it to the caterpillars. Let the big caterpillars have their way with it, and hopefully you're going to be able to enjoy a lot of eastern black swallowtail butterflies in your garden when they hatch into the butterflies. So Cindy says here, yes, it stripped her parsley. And Diane said, I saw a parsley caterpillar a few weeks ago in January. So they can come out. It depends on the weather and the winter. Sometimes they'll come out a little bit earlier but they definitely come out in force once we warm up and start to get into maybe early March or so, once we get into actual spring. So, and they will strip your parsley plants. They're also called parsley worms. That's another common name for them. So if you see them, you need to think long and hard. Do I want the butterflies? Do I really want the parsley and dill? What am I going to do? These are all just things that go into your decision-making process. So one more quick scenario here, and hopefully most people are going to be able to figure this one out. You have a nice, beautiful green vine that's growing on your chain link fence. Let's say maybe you just moved here to Florida from somewhere else, and there's this vine that's got these big, beautiful green leaves on it. It blocks the view of the neighbors. That's always a bonus too. It comes back real quickly every spring, but this year something's eating the leaves. What should you do? Well, here's a picture of what the vine looks like with these big green heart-shaped leaves. And I'll go ahead and make it easy on you. This is an air potato plant. An air potato is a really, really bad invasive plant all over Florida, really all over the Gulf Coast states, and all the way as far off as Hawaii is a problem there too. And we've been trying to find ways of getting rid of it for many years. The USDA and University of Florida researchers found an insect that we released several years ago. And what it does is it helps control this vine because the beetles will eat the leaves. And this is what one of them looks like right here. It's called an air potato beetle. And it is designed, the goal for us and for it is to eat those air potato vines. So be very careful if you buy a house, you've just moved here. Take a little time and a little studying to figure out exactly what is growing in your yard. If it's an invasive, you probably, hopefully, want to seriously think about getting rid of it. And if it's not invasive, if it's native, at least you really want to know what it is and how to best care for it. So with that, let me quit screen sharing here and get back to the actual questions going on here. There we go. I'm back. So let me catch my breath real quick and let me go ahead and share with you, if you're interested in any of our classes and you wonder what else we have coming up, if you just go to www.hernandoextension.com, we have a list there of all of our upcoming classes and whether it's going to be on Facebook Live or Zoom, or we're going to be using Microsoft Teams potentially in the future. Everything you need to know about the class and how to get logged on and watch it is going to be there. So go ahead and bookmark that and check it frequently. We have classes that will help you learn more about the plants growing in your yard, the insects in your garden, how to control them, which ones you don't want to control. So because they're maybe doing something really good in your yard. So let me scroll back up here to the questions and see what we have here. Here's a question, and this is something that we hear about on a regular basis because it's very common. Nicole I had organic potting soil outside and it got infested with cockroaches. Maybe a silly question, but can I still use that soil? And what is the best way to get roaches out and not have this happen again? Yes, you can still use the soil because roaches are a natural part of the environment. And here in Florida, we have a number of species of roaches, and the majority of them really prefer to live outdoors. They live in the mulch, they live in the leaf litter. Obviously, they can live in potting soil, potted plants. They really don't want to live in your house and bother you. There's a couple species that if they get in your house, they can become a major problem, and you may want to get a professional to treat your house and help you control them. Good example of that is German cockroaches. They love living in your house, and they will happily live there. Most of the other ones would happily live in your potting soil outdoors. So if you have any kind of potting soil, if you keep it in a sealed container, that's going to keep the roaches out. if you see a few roaches, and let's say you have a compost bin or compost pile, don't get too worked up over that. They're out there. They're a natural part of the environment, and there really is no good reason to spray for them. The best thing to do is if you have a compost pile, try to get the mixture right so things get actively composting. Roaches don't like an actively composting pile. And if you keep everything else in a closed up container, it's going to help to keep roaches out. So Alberta said she had a major infestation of whiteflies on her vegetable leaves last summer. Yes, that's a very common problem. And whiteflies start off kind of slow in the spring, and their populations go up and up and up. And by the end of summer, you can have a huge problem with whiteflies. And whiteflies are really especially bad because what happens is they can vector plant viruses. So there's a lot of really nasty viruses that tomatoes get, and cucumbers and watermelons and any kind of squash, that if you have whiteflies feeding on them, the whiteflies damage the plants, plus they give you a nasty viral disease on top of that. So they're kind of a double bad whammy. Insecticidal soap works very well on them. So Judy says insecticidal soap, good, bad on what? Yes, insecticidal soap is going to work very well on whiteflies, but you have to be diligent. You have to check on a really regular basis and treat on a regular basis. So if you spray once, you're probably going to kill most of the whiteflies. You need to keep checking and probably do some kind of follow-up spray again with insecticidal soap. Follow the label directions and see how often you can spray with it. And you're probably going to have to spray a few times. So Angela asks, I watched a video about someone who grew nicotine plants, which would be tobacco plants, separate from the tomato plants, and the bugs ended up mostly on the nicotine plants. Would that be safe? That is called a trap crop. And you can do that. There are certain plants that work well for that. I've honestly never heard about growing tobacco and tomatoes. There may be certain pests that, given the choice between tomatoes and tobacco, because they are in the same plant family, they're going to pick tobacco. I know the one I am familiar with is there are certain varieties of sunflowers, the really big heirloom sunflowers, they're really like, they get like 10 feet tall. And if you plant them, and you have a vegetable garden, and you have leaf-footed bugs, 99 times out of 100 will pick that sunflower plant to feed on instead of your tomatoes. So when you have all the leaf-footed bugs on the sunflower, which you're not going to eat, you can spray it or control them somehow there. So there are, believe it or not, some instances where you plant a crop that you're not going to eat, you really don't want, but your goal is to kind of draw the insects away from your vegetable garden. So like I said, I really can't say for sure about growing the tobacco. It's possible. So let me look through here. It looks like Terry got the answer when I was going through that it is syrphid fly larvae feeding on the aphids. Very important one that you want to be familiar with because they are very, very common out there. And here's Susan. She's one of our regulars on our weekly plant clinic on Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. Susan says, what's the best method for applying some of the insecticides you suggested, such as neem oil and insecticidal soap? A manual pump sprayer is cumbersome and doesn't make it easy to spray the leaves fully, especially the underside. The kind of equipment you're going to use is going to depend on the size of your garden. If your garden is small, you could just use a handheld sprayer because you're not spraying a lot of plants. You're not spraying a very, very large area. If you are doing a large area, a quality pump sprayer, just a 1 gallon pump sprayer works well. Of course, they go up to 5 gallon, which can get heavy if you're carrying it around. You can even step up to a 5-gallon backpack sprayer. So it goes on your back like a backpack, and the handle sticks out alongside of you, you pump it up, you go around with the sprayer. So the equipment you use really depends on how big of an area you're spraying. A lot of times, for certain things, I just use a small pump sprayer, a handheld pump sprayer. You can get for like $1 at Walmart or dollar store, and label it. Make sure you label it correctly. That this contains insecticidal soap or neem. And then sometimes if I just need to treat a small area, I can grab it, just treat a small area. Easy done. So Martha asked, should you kill the aphids on the milkweed with a Q-tip and or your fingers? Both of those work. Both of those are effective manual controls. So you can take a Q-tip and you can wipe them off with that. If you have aphids on a plant, you could take a garden hose and just a light spray is going to blow them off the plant. And aphids, even though some of them do have wings, they don't fly very far or very well. So that's a good way to get them off your plants. If you have monarch butterfly caterpillars, it starts to get a little tricky. A lot of times people will just let the aphids go, because even though the aphids are feeding on the milkweed is kind of a unique plant because they are tough as nails. So milkweeds will tolerate aphids and milkweed bugs and even your caterpillars eating all the leaves off of it. And 9 times out of 10, that bare stick plant is just going to grow right back. So, if you keep it watered and otherwise pretty well cared for, they rarely are killed. They tolerate a lot of pest feeding on them because they've evolved that way, along with aphids and caterpillars eating them. So they're able to handle it. So I think with that, we're going to kind of wrap it up here. Claude says, thank you. Excellent material. You are very welcome. More than happy. We try to do this once a month to do an evening class for people that have to work so they can enjoy watching it live and asking their questions live. So, oh, here's a sad one. Janice says her HOA misidentified her Dutchman's pipe vine as an air potato. They ripped out half before I could stop them. I know the difference between the two. They have similar leaves, but they're not that similar. They should have been able to tell the difference between the two. That's where extension can be a really big help for people. A lot of times leaves and bugs, to somebody who doesn't work with them a lot, they all start to look the same. And we can work a lot of times with good, clear photos. You can share photos with us on Facebook. You can email them to us. And a lot of times we can tell you exactly what plant you're dealing with, if it's an invasive or what the situation is. So unfortunately, your HOA should have called us first before they went out there and just started pulling them out. So Sylvia, that's great. Hopefully you would back. Just follow us on Hernando Extension, all one word.com. And we have a full list of all of our classes on there. As soon as we put them up on Facebook and make a Facebook event, they automatically go up on that site. So that's a good way to follow us. Follow us on Facebook. We do a lot on there. And everything we have coming up, we're going to put on Facebook also. So thank you, everybody. And let me real quick here show, once again, my email. If anybody has any further questions, feel free to email me. Or if you'd like to call our office, there's the phone number, 352-754-4433. And we are more than happy to answer your questions. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we will see you next month for another episode of Dinner in a Class. See you then. Bye.